Sweet. All right. What's up, guys? I'm here today with my friend and colleague from the great state of Texas, Ramiro. We have a very fun topic today. I'm gonna let Ramiro introduce himself in a second, but I just want to speak a little bit about how we came to even having today's discussion, which is going to be a lot to do with some of the unique characteristics of men's eating habits. So I recently wrote a book on, men's health, men's fitness. Ramiro and I discussed the book in a call last week, gave me some good feedback on it, and it led to today's video. So Ramiro, thrilled to have you. Why don't you introduce yourself for everyone?
Hi, so I'm Ramiro. I'm a registered dietitian, just like Andy. I also, did some graduate work in behavior science. I teach at a community college. I teach psychology. So when he released the book, it was, one of my favorite things to see was a book that was catered to men and to eating, and kind of sparked, a lot of my interests, right? Both personal interests and academic interest. And just being a dietitian, I'm like, wow, there's a lot here that we can talk about.
Yeah, I don't know if this is your experience, but I know for myself personally, the concept, the theme of being a male dietitian certainly intrigues people. People are curious. I've been interviewed in the past about if I perceive there to be any sort of unique advantages, or if there's anything like that's quite special about it, given that there are relatively few male dietitians. And so it just leads perfectly to today's discussion, which is, again, all about, the unique characteristics of male eating habits. And we have kind of 7 key themes we're going to go through. So basically, I'm going to pick a theme. I'm going to let you deliver a key message based on what you know about the data and all that good stuff. And we'll just let the party flow from there. So I guess, let's start with number 1, which is, the concept or the data suggesting that men have consumed larger portion sizes. So, give us a little bit of insight on that.
Yeah, so the fact that men do it, and it is well documented that men do eat and consume larger portion sizes, right? A lot of that, we've got to be cognizant of culture, right? Whether this is us as professionals or just in general as people, right? We got to be cognizant of culture and socialization, right? Why do we eat, larger portions, right? Could it be a cultural thing? Could it be something that we're socialized as children, right? We're also got to also be cognizant that the food industry markets larger portions to men, right? When you look at even these like food delivery companies, right?
The Hungry Man frozen meals as well.
Yeah, right. Hungry Man frozen meals. They're larger portions because, lean cuisine is not going to cut it. Guys are going to eat that and be like, I want more, right? And let's acknowledge too that there are biological differences that lead to men eating larger portions, right? Men, in general are larger in size, have more lean body mass, right? So there are real legitimate biological factors that play into why men consume more, right? We have a higher basal metabolic rate, those types of things, right? But at the same time too, it's like we live in a world where we're told to eat more, right? Because eating more is a manly thing to do, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of marketing out there, right? There's, food systems that get delivered to your house that are catered just for men, right? And people that work out, right? There's a lot of that going on. And even so, like when we talk about like portions, it's so well acknowledged, in the research that men do eat more, that it's even sparked research, amongst our own profession saying, hey, should we tailor our food frequency questionnaires to the way that men eat, right? Should it reflect some differences in the way that different people eat, right? So yeah, just as a whole, right? Men do eat larger portion sizes, right? And then there's a variety of reasons why, like we've discussed, but definitely considering a big consideration should be like socialization, right? How do we learn to eat these portions, right? When are we told, right? And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, just in general, men do eat bigger portion sizes, right? The meals are catered to be bigger for guys, right? You think about the way that, you go to a restaurant and you order food, right? And, the larger meals are typically the ones that could be consumed by men, right? Because it's, a steak that's bigger, right? There's especially here in Texas, like you will go to places.
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah, everything's bigger in Texas, including, chicken fried steak, right? It's two times the size of my face, right? And it's a totally acceptable thing to do, right? So there's some cultural things that say, hey, this is what you got to do, right? And of course, we as humans and men might re-internalize that. We go back and forth in our mind, what choice do I make, right? So just, being cognizant of the fact that there's an outside, force, and there's also biological forces that lead to, men and having larger portion sizes, right?
Right. And then, it's interesting because in the second part of our notes here, you made a point about, men possibly being more likely to eat to impress others. And I wonder, if there was any qualitative or survey on that. And I'm going to let you answer that as well, or the idea that, men might be more likely to be conditioned to finish their plate. So like the concept of, building on the concept of larger portions, right? The second theme here is maybe eating in above and beyond, and forever the theme is there. So how does that come about in the research data, and then what does that tell us?
Right. So everyone can overeat. That is a possibility for anyone, right? But when we look at some of the research, and this is the thing that I kind of dislike, is that there's not as much as I'd like out there. But when it comes to overeating, right, it could be for a variety of reasons, right? Or even men consuming just in excess could be a way to impress others, right? When you're at a table with a bunch of guys, the last thing you want to be known for is the guy that orders the salad and then doesn't finish half of the entree, right? Even if you're doing it in a health conscious way, right? And even if you're around friends or whoever, right, that are supporting whatever it is you're doing, right? There's still this like consciousness of like, I got to finish my food, right? And that in a lot of ways goes to what we call, family of origin, right? How were you taught to eat, And
Sure.
as a child, were you told like, finish your plate, or were you told to eat intuitively, right? Eat, and when you're full, stop, and then, eat again later. Or was it, being Latino, right? Which is, my cultural background, right? We have to finish what's on our plates. That's how we're
Right.
social, right? And you think about, there is a lot of literature to support that, especially in Latinos, right? There's a lot of differences in the way we eat, right? And we're starting to get more of this research. There really wasn't that much, starting to get a little bit more, right? But when you think about, Latinos, it's almost rude to leave food on the plate. Like, it's considered a very bad thing to do, right? So we made to engage in just eating more, to impress others, to satisfy family members.
And let me ask you this then: is that sentiment? Is that sentiment amplified? In men, like, because obviously that can go across the different gender categories. Theoretically, that
Yeah,
cultural impact. Would you say it's
yeah.
amplified in men in your own personal experience? Obviously, data on that, whether that exists or not, is a different story. But in your experience, does that sentiment amplified in men? Yeah,
I think so. In my
yeah,
years, I've been a dietitian for almost 11 years. In my years of counseling male clients and male patients, right, there was a bigger sentiment towards that, right? They felt
okay,
a greater need to eat more. They thought it was like, right, this is what's going to get me big and strong as a child. That's what I was told, right?
yeah.
And so now as an adult, right, I eat everything, right? And I make it a point to finish what I'm eating, right? And it's really interesting just to kind of see how that plays out from one side of the spectrum all the way to the other side, right, from the past to the present, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it just in practice, right, with clients, right, a lot of it has been like, well, what, tell me, why do you eat? Like, did you even want to finish the meal? And a lot of them will say no, like, this is, I just kind of did it because of XYZ.
My mom, when she watches me sometimes, because I myself personally, and this is purely a personal characteristic, I tend to eat larger meals later in the day. So if I'm having dinner with my family on occasion, my mom will often say, like, are you hungry? Why are you still eating? And my dad says the same, so it's not depending on that. But it's very interesting. And then that leads to the next part of our discussion, right? Because there's the quantity aspect, fair enough, but there's also the quality aspect. And what you've noted down here, which obviously is problematic, is that there's higher amount of saturated fat potentially in the male diet. The data, if you look at the prescription pharmaceutical data, given that cholesterol medication is very frequently prescribed in men, even under the age of 40, it's among the most
Wow,
frequently
yeah.
prescribed medications, and obviously saturated fat being linked with cholesterol and so on and so forth. Yeah. Some thoughts on that, data on that.
Yeah, and so for sure, we definitely have the data to show that, yeah, men do eat higher saturated fats, right? Usually of
Mhm.
animal origin, right? More consumption of red meats, more consumption of smoked and cured meats, right? Higher consumption
Yeah.
of processed foods, right? And you've even talked about this a lot in your own, blog post and your Instagram post, is the idea that like men will purposely avoid something like soy, right? Because
I
they
was
think
gonna say,
just it's I don't want to eat that because it's associated with this or that. And whether or not it is, right,
It isn't,
is
but
just a personal choice, right? Whether people
yeah,
believe in it or not, right? And we're pushing against the grain. But yeah, for sure. When we look at the nutrients that men lack in their diets, right? They lack a variety of fruits and vegetables, right?
yeah,
When we talk about the average man, right? Obviously, a group like athletic men is different, right? They are
yeah,
eating for a different reason, right? They eat more processed foods, right? And the reason why they're eating it is could be perhaps, an occupation thing, right? Like, if you're in an occupation, and I'll just name a few, right? Like
sure.
if you're a police officer, if you're a truck
Mhm.
driver, right? If you're a sales representative, right? Occupations that we know are so very segregated by gender, right?
Sure.
You know, and it's getting better, right? Occupations are getting more 50-50, but
Right.
just thinking about those, right? Those type of occupations lead people to eat on the go, right? And what are you eating on the go? You're usually eating fast food, right? You're going through, sometimes you get to sit down, but you're eating quick, you're eating fast, you're eating more processed food. You could have brought something that you just microwave, right? You could
Hmm.
eat something that just comes out of a package. And while there's nothing wrong with those things, right? We do know that depending on what you're eating, right, it makes a big difference in how good your nutrition is, right? Um, and men, yeah, when we're talking about men, right, there's, like I said, red meat is a big, thing with guys, right? We like our steak. And again, I hail from the state of Texas, so we love our brisket, we love our Mexican food, and we love our steaks, right? Um,
Right, and that actually
it's a
leads to
big difference.
something else interesting as well, right? Is that like years ago when I was starting out as a writer, in conjunction with everything else I'm doing, I wrote a piece for a vegan website called Plant Based News, right? Or it's certainly got so the website name speaks for itself, and they had me do some research around sentiment around men becoming vegans, and survey data that I had referenced at the time show that you know I can't remember who was surveyed precisely, but there was some sense that like eating more plant-based or veganism as a man wasn't looked upon in a good light. You know what I mean? That sentiment had been expressed in some qualitative studies, and so that
Yeah.
obviously is there. Then yes, to your point, soy, the concerns about soy being quote unquote feminizing as it is often referred in the literature, although that's there's no data to support that. And the irony, the grand irony of it all is that soy actually reduces cholesterol levels. And again, going back to cholesterol being one of the most frequently prescribed medications in men,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's a
And we're
little
back to
bit,
chronic illness, right? A
yeah,
big topic in public health, right? You having an MPH, right? You know those things, right? When we talk about, population health, right? And cholesterol and things like that and chronic illness, a lot of it, yes, and endogenously produced cholesterol, is definitely a factor in, who takes and who
sure,
doesn't take medication. But at the same time, we look at diet, and the way people eat, right? And
yeah,
just consumption of fiber, right? It's lacking in men's diets, right? And like you said, vegan-based options are, way better, right? Data could show that there's just improvement in, blood levels of different nutrients and different things that we're measuring in these lab tests. But at the same time, right, they're looked down upon, right? People don't want them, do those things. There's even people that this, of course, anecdotally, there's even people that, on, social media dedicate themselves to showing others that, look, you can be a vegan and you can be a bodybuilder, right? You can
right.
be a vegan and you can do these things.
I think people need to. I think people do need to see that because of how widespread the kind of just not necessarily how widespread the misunderstandings are, and so a documentary like The Game Changers, despite its the liberties it took, scientific liberties and its claims. I mean, it does demonstrate that veganism is not mutually exclusive with fitness or excelling as an athlete, right?
Right.
Now, this also, and then you allude to this, but for me, my personal philosophy around nutrition, and certainly the way I explain to my clients is like, I don't really believe you get healthy by what you don't do. You get healthy by what you do, and so it's as much about what you incorporate as opposed to avoiding something. But the problem is, as you've noted here on the fourth point here of our conversation, is that men also consume less fiber and micronutrients, and particularly less fruits and vegetables. So, give us a little bit of insight there. Like, what does the data show from that perspective?
And so from that perspective, and this is also again self-disclosure is like I eat meat, it's just,
Mhm.
it's what I do, right? That's part of my diet, right?
Yep.
And like you said, it's neither good nor bad, neither here nor there. But what are you eating with it, right? It is possible to
Yep.
eat lean cuts of meats and still have very favorable cholesterol profiles, right? Or
Yep.
even just general health and avoid chronic illness. But the other thing that happens is what are you eating with that, right? And so what we see is that men don't usually eat fruits and vegetables. And it's funny because some studies show that, and these are more qualitative ones that will show like men will eat fruits and vegetables when they're nagged by their wives or girlfriends to do so, right? Or their mothers
Right.
to do, right? So it almost takes an extra push for us to do it, right? And the other thing too is, when we think about just in general, vegetables, right? When you think about one of the things that I always, think about is like, when in my own intake of eating vegetables, a lot of it was because I didn't really know how to cook them, right? To make
Yeah.
them taste in a way that I really wanted to eat them, right? And this kind of goes back to cooking, right? And men and what they do and how they do, and just looking at the way that a person structures their plate, right? We
Right.
talk about, how we eat and how we eat, right? What you put on your plate matters, like you said. It's what you eat that matters, right? And we know that, men don't consume as much high fiber, in their diets. A lot of times, the lack of fiber can lead to other things like more issues with constipation, right? Or other types of issues, right? Um,
Yeah. And the bigger picture as well, even, it's March, it's colorectal cancer awareness month. And I think
there
they
you
had,
go.
and fiber, dietary fiber, is a massive factor in risk reduction. So colorectal cancer being like the third most common cancer in men, and the third most fatal cancer, I believe, in men as well. And, lack of fiber, to your point, as the data suggests, is a leading risk factor. And high processed meat intake and high red meat intake, although less so than processed meat, is also a risk factor. So it's no surprise that dietary trends dictate disease trends. You know what I mean? But certainly that's very, very interesting. And there are other let's say problematic trends that occur in males. And
Yeah.
certainly you made a point about alcohol consumption. So let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, so and this also is stratified by age group.
Sure.
And in some studies, age makes no difference, right? As we look at adults, right, that consume alcohol, right? But yeah, we know that, gender impacts, being a man impacts the type of alcohol choice, right?
Yeah.
Men are more likely to pick beer or liquor, right? And just looking at the alcohol choices, right? So the research does show, yeah, there's some differences in the alcohol choices that men make.
Right.
And then the choices can also be situational choices, right? And cultural choices, right? How were
Sure.
you brought up and how were you socialized around the idea of alcohol and being a guy and what you should pick and what you should drink, right? No guy wants to be the guy at the bar with the foo-foo drink, right? With the little umbrella and the piece of fruit, Maybe it's becoming a little bit better now these days where craft
Uh,
cocktails have kind of changed that, right? And so it's like people want those, because it looks so cool, right? But again, one of those things is like what you choose, right? It's both situational and cultural, right? If it's situational, we could be talking about like when men are amongst each other, right? They may overdrink, right? We both know that the recommendation for men, right, is two beers, two shots of alcohol, whatever. We
yeah.
know very well no one follows that. They're unrealistic, guidelines because nobody really does follow that, right? But when you talk about, binge drinking, it is higher amongst men, right? And we kind of have to go into like why is it higher amongst men? The research shows, right, when anyone drinks, right, doesn't
Mhm.
matter who you are, a lot of it is a coping strategy, right?
Sure.
And when we talk about men, right, men process stress differently, right? And in some occasions, right? And we talk about that, right? There are, some differences in fight or flight responses, right? Stress causes people to overeat, right? And
Mhm.
specifically, there's plenty of data to show that, this fight or flight response that's in our bodies and stress eating, right, is higher amongst men, right? While disordered eating or differences in eating patterns can be seen differently in other people, like specifically with men, right? Stress-induced eating, right, might cause binges in eating, which also could cause binges in drinking, right? If we're talking
Right.
about binge drinking being used as a coping mechanism, right? Also, let's talk about the younger men, right? In college, right? Binge drinking is a bonding thing that guys do,
Sure.
right? It's a thing that happens, right? It's a thing that they do together to bond. And again, more frequent drinking later in life, right? Binge drinking isn't going to say, oh, you're going to be an alcoholic for the rest of your life, right? Not at all, right? In a way, in college, in that specific age group, it's more of a bonding thing of how it's done, right? But remember too, when we are learning our eating behaviors, we're typically learning our adult eating behaviors in adolescence, childhood and
Sure.
adolescence. And then, adolescence, for some people who don't know, actually ends in your mid-20s, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
actually end in 18, this number. You're adolescent, you're an adolescent medically until you're like in your early 20s, right? And then
Right.
after that, you're considered an adult, yeah, in the medical perspective, right? So it's a lot of these things, right, that can talk about, with men and the choice of alcohol and different things for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so that's very interesting data, and I mean, and that leads us to the next point, which is also I suppose on the negative side of the health effects is disordered eating in males. So any unique characteristics about and the types of males who are more likely to having disorders or anything else in that realm that is maybe distinct or notable. Yeah, that's the next point that I like to discuss.
Yeah, and so obviously one very obvious choice is that, or one very obvious population within men that there's plenty of research to show that there are certain types of men, in this case athletes, that
Hmm.
we see a lot of disordered eating with, right? And for a long time, right, people thought like, and we know this for sure, that eating disorders amongst men are underreported, right? Um, and on the population overall are also underreported, right? More people probably struggle with it than they actually admit. But with men, they tend to be very underreported, right?
Right.
And sometimes the belief is, disordered eating only occurs in certain types of athletes, right? Like wrestlers or, horse jockeys, boxers, MMA fighters, those are
Yeah.
all populations that are at risk for disordered eating just because of the fact that a lot of what they have to do is based on weight, right? You can't wrestle in this category unless you meet the weight, right?
Right.
And if you even just look at the way that like wrestlers and boxers, MMA fight, any type of male that has to meet a certain weight in order to compete in a category, right?
Right.
And you start looking at that either in the research or anecdotally as clinicians, you begin to see that yeah, like they're doing stuff that like they're binging and purging, they're restricting, they're doing things that could clinically be diagnosed as disordered eating, right? But at the same time, in some ways it's just situational to that specific, athletic group.
Right.
And I'm not saying this is present in every wrestler or anything like that, or every boxer, but these
Of
are things
course.
that are for sure out there. The literature supports them, and there's more research coming out where people are thankfully being more forthcoming about these struggles. Now,
Good.
overall, right? When we look at things like muscle dysmorphia, body dysmorphia, disordered eating and whatnot, people tend to think, well, these things just exist in athletic people or athletic men.
Right.
But the reality is actually all of us, have could have some sort of disordered eating in the way that we eat in our everyday life. Now, is it a diagnosable, eating
Sure.
disorder?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. Not for everybody, but everyone has some form of disordered eating, right? And all that kind of just goes back to how you're using food. What is your relationship with food, right? Is it a comfort thing? Is it a reward thing? Is it just it's just food, right? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about this with anybody, right, we know that disordered eating often becomes a coping mechanism, right, for something else, something bigger, right? And so when we think about disordered eating and men, right, I think a lot of men suffer with some form of disordered eating, right? Just
Right.
in talking to my previous patients and clients, right, one of the things I'd always ask about is like, well, when did you binge? What you ate a lot, right? Or maybe we didn't call it a binge, but I would just call it something like you ate a lot, or you talked to me about overeating. When was this? When did this happen? They'd be like, oh, I was coming home from work. I had such a terrible day. On the way
Right.
home, I just stopped. I got this, and this to the drive-through, and I just ate it all. And then
Right.
they're feeling a lot of guilt. They're feeling a lot of shame, right? It's not something men want to talk about, guilt and shame and vulnerability, but it is something that's really important, right? Especially when working with clients and working with patients, right, who are at a predisposition for this, for a variety of reasons.
And let me ask you this then. This is interesting. This will be anecdotal based on our professional experiences. But do you find that because you made a point there about perhaps men being less likely to discuss more emotional or sentimental aspects of their nutrition or their interaction with food? Do you find that to be the case in your professional experience? And if so, feel free to elaborate on that.
Yes, but it also has to do with the way the clinician approaches that conversation, right?
Sure.
setting the stage with a patient or a client and saying like, we're going to talk about XYZ, right? I just want to learn from you. I want to learn what you're doing, and then I can help you if you let me, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's one way that I've been able to get, men to be more forthcoming during my sessions with them about something like this, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because just in counseling, again, 11 years of experience as an RD, and I've
Yep.
counseled many, many guys. And I can tell you this, a lot of guys, avoid conversations when we talk about emotional eating, right? They
Sure.
don't want to admit to it, right? They don't want to talk about it. And sometimes it could just be like I could be doing a diabetes education. I could be talking to a
Right.
diabetic about. So I'm noticing in your here, your glucose is spiking in these areas or these times, and I'll ask them what happened. And this, I just had a big meal, or I just did this. And a lot of times when I probe a little bit more, turns out it really wasn't a meal. Like they just kind of sat down and ate a whole bag of chips,
Right.
or they sat down and they did something that spiked it, right? But in essence, it was emotional eating, right? And maybe we're not as forthcoming, with our clinicians, which is something that further research really needs to explore, right? And again, it's also about educating all clinicians, not just dietitians, about how to approach conversations with men when it comes to eating, if in fact it is a sensitive subject for that person. There are some people who
Yeah.
don't like talking about it for sure.
Right. And no, and then that's fascinating. That's a good, transition to the next thing I want to discuss, which I'm actually looking forward to hearing your thoughts on. And so, the last point on our list to discuss is the differences in socialization of men and boys with eating behaviors, which I think is a natural carryover from what you were saying. So, what kind of key messages did you want to get across, within this theme?
So, our eating origin story, right, starts at home, right? Children
Mhm.
learn their eating behaviors at home, not just in the way they're taught, but in observation, right? Observational learning,
Mhm.
right? And so we as children start observing like, well, how do people eat, right? What am I supposed to eat, right? Very early on, we develop food preferences, right? We know what
Mhm.
food we don't like, and for a variety of reasons, right? But one thing is, in children, right, boys, especially during adolescence, right, boys are told like you've got to eat more, right? And in some ways, it's both a thing that's told, but it's also an unspoken thing, just in within culture, right?
Yeah.
Where in some cases, girls might be getting the opposite message: eat
Yeah.
less, like,
Right.
And so this is again goes back to how we learn our eating behaviors, right, and how that starts in childhood. Who are we watching eat, right? How are we taught, right? Do fathers play a role in this example, right? And we know, so childhood research actually shows that children tend to overeat when they eat with their friends, when they're actually eating around other people, because your mindfulness is not turned on, right? And
Right.
this can be generalized to anybody, right? Mindfulness and intuitiveness in eating, right, are affected when you eat in groups. They are affected when you eat at home versus when you eat in social settings. And they
Right.
are obviously affected, when you're watching TV, right? When you're not engaged in what's in front of you, right? And you're just watching TV, mindless eating is just a thing that happens, right? But where do we learn all that? We start learning that in childhood. It develops a little bit more in adolescence, right? And eating is highly encouraged, by biology and growth in adolescence, right?
Yeah.
People just in general, boys for sure, will definitely eat a lot during adolescence because that's when we're growing, right?
Yeah.
After
Very
adults.
high needs. Yeah.
Yeah, very high, and it's interesting too because that at that point, adolescence is when a man's testosterone is at its highest peak, right? Because it's being used to define and to promote secondary sex characteristics and
Right.
different things in guys, right? And I know you've done a lot of talk on testosterone before, but this is when it's at its highest, right? So we also have to look at, is testosterone, right? It's a hormone, right?
Yep.
And its effect on eating, right? And because it's higher in men, right? Is this spike in it, during the adolescence phase, could potentially be something that's affecting the way we eat later, right? And then occupations. The last point I'll make is just occupations, right? Depending on what occupation you pick, right, there are differences in patterns of behavior in occupations. Earlier, I mentioned like people that have on the go occupations, right? Guys that have on the go occupations, right? But also, let's just for a moment pause our occupation as dietitians, right?
Yep.
We are in a female dominated field, right? And of course, I always joke with my dietitian friends about this. It's like, right? Are we going to eat like dietitians today, or are we going to eat just like whatever, like
Oh, that's funny.
regular
Yeah,
people? And so it's one of those things we often talk about. Occupations, right? There's more eating on the go with certain male, segregated occupations. There's more eating out throughout the day, right? So if you're a sales rep and you're taking people out to eat, your clients out to eat, right? You might be encouraged to eat more, right? You might be encouraged, to eat out
yeah.
more
I have
often. You
lots of
can
clients
see,
in those positions, so that's a good point, and that's a
yeah,
very unique. That's a unique challenge.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's fascinating, and I say this often, but one of the biggest things that I've learned, being a dietitian almost 10 years now is just the extent to which experiences in the home, and I don't mean that specifically, male, female, or otherwise, but the experiences in the home during adolescence and youth can shape people's perceptions of foods and relationship with foods. And now obviously there is another layer to that, which is very fascinating, which you brought up, is that is those experiences are also shaded by by gender as well, right? And it could be that men are more likely to experience certain things, females are more likely to experience certain things, and that further can perpetuate that influence. So it is really fascinating. But let me ask you this then, you know I guess empirically, again focusing on studies, is there, we've probably discussed this already to some extent, but is there a difference in which in a family setting or an adolescent setting men are interacted with that could lead to differences in behaviors around food? Anything specific or anything notable? And then again, the point about the occupations is really interesting, but anything else in that realm that you want to touch on? Yeah, because I do find that quite fascinating.
yeah. I mean, just looking at that realm, right, in our family, right,
Mhm.
how we're raised, right? Culture plays a big role, right? Who are examples of eating, right? How your father eats, right, is likely
Sure,
how you might eat, right?
sure.
And so when we look at the data and the evidence, right, there's a lot of mixed back and forth. There's some data that says no, there is no difference. There's actually other bigger social factors, that are
Right,
at play rather than the smaller ones. But there's lots of data to show, how you're raised, and those factors really do play a big role in lots of things, not just how you eat, but do you value fitness, right? Do you work out? Are
sure.
those things that were instilled in you as a child, right? And then as an adult, do you carry on that behavior, right? Um, and so that's a big thing. And then just overall, overarching, just in society, right? When we look at how men are socialized, right? And just lots of things that relate to how we eat, and how food companies target men,
Yep.
right, with the way that they eat. And lots of different things, right? For a lot of men, right, eating is a convenience, right? And I'll tell you this, they do it as a convenience, or like the way they eat is done for convenience. Let me rephrase that. Yeah.
Mhm.
So like it's easier for men, because, and I'll go into why in a second, but it's easier for men to just pick something up on the go and eat it, right? We don't want to think about it. We've got XYZ things to do, and this could be just for anybody, right? But men tend to do this quite a bit more, right? When we look at the research.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's kind of interesting too, um, is just as we look at this idea of, like, men and eating on the go and processed foods, we have to come back and have a conversation about cooking.
Right.
And I want to share a quick personal story.
Yeah.
Is for years I would tell my mom, like, teach me how to cook, and she would be like, no, you don't. That's not something you need to learn. You're gonna get married and
Interesting.
your wife's gonna cook it. And I'm like, that's, how do you know that? And I was like, what if I
Right.
marry someone who doesn't like to cook? So she didn't teach me how to cook, right? And
Right.
one thing I always tell males, or anybody, any client, any patient, is if you eat, you need to learn how to cook. You at least need to know the
Yeah.
basics of cooking, right? And when we talk about guys, like, grilling is a great thing that guys like to do, but
Right.
other types of cooking methods maybe not be, are not a thing, right? And guys want something quick. They want. I remember counseling athletes, and the main thing that they used to tell me would be like, I want it to be quick. Like, what can I throw really quickly, right? Into, a pan, a big pan, make it in big portions, easy, and I can just meal prep, and it's just, it's a done thing, right?
Right.
So a lot of that, we got to be cognizant that we don't socialize guys to cook, right? We more so socialize
My,
women.
my, my dad can't really cook, and you're right. I always tell my clients, I usually say if you're cooking, you're winning, is what I
Yeah.
is the expression that I use very often. Um,
But here's the
so
funny thing. Here's the
yeah,
funny thing on the research is that the majority of chefs, executive chefs, right, people who own the restaurant, are men, right?
right.
But then again, at home, right? The majority of people who do the cooking are usually women, right?
Right.
And this is really important because part of an assessment, a nutrition assessment, and depending on your clientele, and a question I would ask is, who does the cooking at home? Who does the
Right.
grocery shopping, right?
Right.
Because if you're not that person, then I need to speak to that person, right? And this
Right.
this goes back to brings me back to my assessment as a renal dietitian, right? It was always part of my assessment to ask, okay, besides how many meals and how many snacks, the next question was, do you cook? And if not, who
Right.
cooks at home? Who does the grocery shopping? Right. And I think, a big part of it is that, when men approach something like cooking, some men are kind of intimidated by it. They're like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
And I think it's getting better. A lot of guys, I'm not saying guys avoid it. A lot of guys really do enjoy it, right? There's a lot of food bloggers out there that are guys. But you've got to consider the average guy may not have a lot of cooking knowledge, right?
Right.
Unless it's a really big passion for them. Um,
That's a good
Again,
point. That's a
myself, I
good
love to
point.
cook. I love to cook. You
Yeah.
look at, my social media, it's about cooking and it's about food, right?
Right.
And I love to do that, right? But that may just be me, but in general, we know that men are not taught cooking skills, right? And if they learn it, they usually learn it on their own because it's a passion, right? And that goes back to, again, how we are socialized, right? And again, very good points that we both make is, right, if, like you said, if you're cooking, you're winning, right? And for
Yep.
me, it's like, if you're eating, you should know how to cook. It's a
Yeah,
just
that's a good
take
that's a good point. And I mean, obviously, it makes sense because, going back to, your points on the dietary trends in men regarding more saturated fat, less fruits and vegetables. There is obviously disparity as well in the cooking skills required in preparing those foods. You know what I mean? Obviously, processed meats are certainly a path of least resistance, whereas vegetables, in most cases, to make them, depending on the individual, of course, to make them more palatable, some cooking skills and time are required. So it is all intertwined. And I mean, we've only really just scratched the surface, but I mean, it's good stuff and it's interesting stuff, especially coming from two male dietitians. I mean, are there any other, like, impactful insights into, uniquely male eating characteristics that you want to throw out there, and just for the people to be aware of, whether there are colleagues who, obviously work with males and maybe want to get a fresh take on and maybe reimagine how they approach things, or for men listening to become self-aware about their own, let's say, strengths and limitations in their approach to food. Yeah. Any other key take homes
right.
there?
I think just, as far as that goes, I think we've talked about kind of the bigger pictures when it comes to those buckets.
Mhm.
But I think, another one, and this is not necessarily food, but it's something I know you with your clients probably run into, sports dietitians
Mhm.
definitely run into, and it's supplementation, right?
Right.
When you're talking about, guys and working out, everyone wants a competitive edge, whether they're doing it with nutrition or whether they're
Right.
doing it with supplementation, right?
Right.
Everyone wants to be better. How do I get bigger gains, faster gains? How do I retain? How do I do this, right? And it leads into this conversation of like using food as a performance enhancer, right? But also using supplements, right? And so as clinicians or even people within their own, for themselves, you've got to ask the question, why are you eating in this way, right? What do you
Right.
hope to gain from this? Is this done for performance? In the same way that we've got to ask the question, like, well, why do you take the supplement? What do you think the supplement's going to do? There's a lot of research out there that supplementation, for muscle building can be very beneficial, right?
Right.
And it depends too on the goal and what supplement we're talking about, right? But we're certainly not saying that it's not a thing, right? It's definitely a thing, right? But I always come back to my patients and like, what is it that's making you do that? It's like, well, I just want to get bigger. I want more blood flow. Like I'm taking this or that, or I'm eating these foods, and
Yeah.
you'd be surprised what people will just find and just start eating, hyper eat. Just go on this, like, oh, I'm gonna eat more of this. I heard this was gonna do this. This was gonna boost my testosterone, or this was gonna do that.
Right.
When again, in fact, one of the things that we do know is that the more lean body mass, the higher the testosterone level, right? I think there's lots of factors, right, affecting testosterone. Testosterone's, higher in the morning, right? Stress affects it, sleep
Right.
affects it, right?
Yeah.
Lots of things affect it, right? And so, also probing into ourselves, like, if we are eating, in a specific way, why are we eating in that way? Especially when we talk about eating for performance, right? I mean, again, whether you're doing it for yourself or you're doing it as a clinician, right? Being cognizant of the things that matter to men when you're counseling them, right, is a really big factor, right? You know, and again, that's where the context comes in, right? Of both of us kind of being male RDs and understanding
Mhm.
the inner workings of guys and being able to pick up on something that may have been missed by someone else, right? And this isn't to say that like, oh, because you're not a male dietitian, you don't understand how men eat. Not at all, but much rather like
It's a unique
humans,
perspective to say
it is.
at the bare minimum, it's a unique perspective. And you know, one of your points got me to thinking. You know, again, this is anecdotally, this is professional practice reflections, of course, not necessarily empirical data, but certainly over the years, I think, you know, you mentioned about the supplements and working on stuff. My sense, I believe, is that, you know, men are more into like, okay, you know, and this could be related as well to life expectancy. I think men that I encounter are more likely interested, like, okay, you know, the biohacking, this kind of stuff like
Yeah.
that. You know what I mean? What can I do to live longer? You know what I mean? That, like, that kind of sentiment, you know, if I had to make a commentary on the whole, is much more likely to come from men. Of course, men do have a lower life expectancy, surely in part due to the characteristics, the very characteristics we discussed today, right? So, you know, guys who are listening to this, there are things to work on. You know what I mean? It's obviously it's not anyone's fault. I mean, it's cultural, societal conditioning. You know, obviously there's biological roles to play as well. But this was a very fascinating conversation today, my friend. It was a good one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll
Yeah,
say one
yeah,
last
yeah, yeah.
thing.
Do it. Go ahead. Let's
One
go.
last thing. You
Yeah,
you
yeah.
brought it up right now, and I'm like, ooh, that's a good thing to mention, right? When we talk about just life expectancy, right?
Mhm.
We know that one thing that leads to lower life expectancy obviously is eating. It's occupations, right?
Mhm.
Which we know are heavily segregated by gender, some occupations. But
Mhm.
another thing is stress, right? And stress hormones, right?
Sure.
Research is very clear that anyone who experiences high levels of stress and stress hormones, right, activates that fight or flight response in our
Right.
bodies, which then increases levels of hormones, right? And people who continuously operate in a state of stress, right? And this is very clear in mental health literature, right? People who constantly operate in high levels of anxiety, high
Mhm.
levels of stress, have a lower life expectancy, right? So stress is just another factor that can lead to lower life expectancy in men because men in some cases in some studies have reported higher levels of stress, whether that's because of their job or whatever, right? Stress is another thing. And, you know, we could go down a whole nother rabbit hole just
Yeah.
talking about stress and stress induced hormones and, you know, how that relates to eating and men and different things like that. But I think that's something that you brought up with that, you know, the comment on life expectancy, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about, you know, stress and all the other factors that play into that as well as nutrition for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean that's actually also really, really interesting stuff. And I think this is something that you know, I've read so many articles, but this is not a topic I've explored thoroughly. I mean, I have on some level, obviously, you know, having written the book on, you know, men's health, and I do discuss, you know, men's health in certain contexts. But I think, you know, you've inspired me. Today's discussion inspired me to look into this a little bit more and probably write a blog post on it. But I think this was a great video, a great chat. You know,
Yeah.
you did a great job articulating, you know, your knowledge and experience. So I appreciate having you on. I appreciate your, you know, your generous feedback on my book and our previous discussion. And yeah, I look forward to sharing this one. So thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was really fun. This is kind of maybe like first or second time I do something like this.
Yeah, you're
But thank you
natural.
for
You're
having me.
great. Yeah, yeah, great energy, and yeah, you got the points across, and yeah, I enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone who watches will too. All right, guys. Well, that's it for today's chat, and yeah, we'll catch you. I'll catch you next time. All right. Goodbye from Ramiro and I. See ya.